You know what I mean?
Right. Once you fix Congress, the other things are fixed by definition almost. Like, because it's downstream. The money that Congress is spending is going downstream. And if you get the device correct, then the things that the device are going to be dealing with, on some level, you would hope that it would be a capacity to have a better outcome. So, no, I totally get what you mean on this front. Fix Congress, fix the corruption, and the other stuff, hopefully, will start to work itself out a little bit more. At the very least, the outcomes will be more in reach, or the best outcomes will be more in reach. New Pentagon policies are set to allow open transgender people to serve in the military. As of April 30th, the Pentagon says the rules will, quote, provide a path for those in service for medical treatment, gender transition, and recognition in one's self-identified gender, unquote. The announcement coincides with yesterday's International Transgender Day of Visibility. Good. If a person wants to put the uniform on, let them put the uniform on. I don't care whether they're black, white, gay, straight, or transgender. You know, the interesting part to this, and we can get to it later at the 9 o'clock. Let's keep going. Four people were killed, including a child, and one other injured in a mass shooting at Orange County office complex. Information about the suspect and the motives have not been released. And that's another mass shooting. Great. Italy has expelled 2 Russian diplomats after an Italian naval officer was caught selling naval documents to an alleged Russian spy handler. Italy's foreign minister said it's an extremely serious matter. Russia said it would retaliate. More retaliation. Juan Antonio Hernandez has been sentenced to life for drug trafficking in order to forfeit just over $138 million for distributing 185 tons of cocaine, purchasing firearms illicitly, and engaging in large-scale bribery, and is complicit in at least 2 murders. Juan Antonio is the brother of current Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, also widely known or thought to be involved in drug trafficking, and the subject of an ongoing investigation by U.S. prosecutors. Yeah, I've mentioned this once before. One of the gentlemen during one of one of the White House press briefings was asked basically, is this guy a partner? And the question in and of itself is so interesting because the question gets across that we've worked with the president of that country, and it even hints at the previous coup that took place and asking, hey, is this particular president a partner in the way that we're saying that this guy is a partner, considering the drug charges? Very interesting, and it's something that should be asked. It should be asked in a more straightforward way, in the sense that did that coup benefit us? In the people that have been showing up at the country, in the gangs that are started to rove and take over Honduras, and in the president that was elected that was basically selling coke. Has that been positive for us? And if it hasn't been positive for us, should we potentially, at the very least, can we consider changing the policy of coups and running roughshod over South American governments?
Well, and there's also the possibility that, which seems to me pretty probable, which is that at least some branches of our government and our intelligence community were completely aware of what was going on. We overthrew Zelaya. This guy came in a bit later to fill his stead, and we would be aware of what they're doing, is my assumption. If our intelligence services are good at what they do, which in some cases they seem to be, then they would know. And therefore, the idea is they would have let this slide for a period, for the time being at least, in order to let him continue to reign in the country. And then for some reason, about 5-6 years ago, the tide started to turn. The assumption is, again, the tide started to turn, and we started to investigate it. And this is a kind of, not saying specifically it's blackmail, but it's a kind of lingering thread that you can pull when you want to put that person into a position of insecurity and to start to crack down on them if they start to turn away from you, or if it just becomes more beneficial for you to do so, more advantageous to do that. You get where I'm going with that, Jamarl.
Yeah, that's why dictators are, well, that's one of the reasons why dictators are good. When you get tired of them, you can always create the things that guy's a dictator. Forget the fact that you've been working with the guy for the last X number of years. Yeah, It's easy to turn against them at that point. Yeah, and it's easy to create this kind of foment of resentment against that particular individual when you want to get rid of them. Not to mention, dealing with one guy is always easier than dealing with a government or with a democracy. Democracies can make choices that are in their best interests. That dictator is going to make choices in his own best interests. Let's do one more. The country of Yemen has received its first shipment of COVID-19 vaccines. 1/3 of 1 million AstraZeneca doses arrived at the southern port of Aden. The AstraZeneca vaccines, quote, will enable health workers and other priority populations vulnerable to COVID-19 to be protected against the virus, unquote. UNICEF said in a statement yesterday. The batch is part of 1.9 million doses that Yemen will receive throughout 2021. I suspect what Yemen wants, as opposed to the vaccine, even though it wants the vaccine, is stop the indiscriminate bombing. That will probably go a lot longer. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Well, as we were having a conversation about earlier, the migrant crisis has been taking up a lot of the bandwidth, and for obvious and for good reason. The number of people that are at the border has been somewhat shocking. Biden on Tuesday allowed the press, Associated Press, in to see the migrants, and you had hundreds of people in areas where hundreds of people were not supposed to be. If I'm not mistaken, one area had over 400 people when really only 32 people were supposed to be there. And you had all of these mats on the floor with this kind of weird sci-fi metallic wrapping that are basically on top of the kids as they lay down, packed like sardines. To have a conversation about, let's say, the migrant crisis and the reasons for the migrant crisis, and not just the reasons for the migrant crisis, even a good policy that had somewhat difficult outcomes, we're joined with Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Absolutely. So, Ted, let's start with the migrant crisis for a moment. Biden, in his press conference, basically made somewhat of a speech that said, look, I am not going to send these kids back in order to walk all the way back to wherever they came from, either Honduras or elsewhere. But Biden also made this argument that it's not just that I'm a nice guy. That's not the reason why they're coming. But in retrospect, it is. The numbers are increasing. And the weird part is, with the mainstream media talking about it, saying Biden has led the kids through, Biden has led the kids through, look at all of these kids at our border, look at all of these kids at our border. It creates a big bullseye around the fact that you are not turning kids away. And when that bullseye, and when that's articulated, and when that's even understood, even the very act of saying don't come gets across that the kids are being allowed into the border, it will create an increase almost by its own momentum. And not to mention Donald Trump is gone, and that snarling face of stay out is also gone. Regardless of what Biden wanted, the temperament change and the rule change of saying, yes, if a kid comes to the border, we'll allow the kid through. Both of those things instigate what I would consider an impetus and a rush at the border. What are your thoughts, Ted? Am I, do you think I'm wrong on this? Am I being unfair to Biden on this? Because what it seems like to me is that media and Biden can't honestly admit we have been instigating ourselves in those countries to deleterious effect for decades. Nor can Biden admit that the policy of allowing kids in, even though it may be ethical, has consequences. What are your thoughts, Ted?
Well, Jamarl, there's no arguing with the facts, and what you've laid out is absolutely what's going on, and there's no question that basic human motivation being what it is, things are going to go that way. One interesting factoid is that every time there is a new president, immigrants who are hoping to gain access to the United States across the southern border come in larger numbers. That happened even when Trump paradoxically assumed office in January of 2017, and it happened previously in January of 2009 with Obama. So it seems to be that there's a sort of an expectation that a new president is more likely to be friendly, and it's not like people who are living in countries like Honduras are able to or inclined to sort of study the foreign policy and the immigration policy of a new president or be aware of what they campaigned on. They just sort of say, well, there's a new president, maybe it'll be better this time. But I think it is true that this is a classic example of what Ward Churchill would call chickens coming home to roost. I was reading up more about Honduras and the U.S. involvement in the overthrow of democratically elected President Zelaya there by the Obama-Biden administration. It's not that Honduras was paradise on earth before the coup, but it has disintegrated into massive corruption, political violence, government oppression by basically what is a military junta ever since. And, Americans need to understand that, in a way, look, another paraphrase where we broke it and we own it now. So these people are coming across our border. It's incumbent upon us, I would say, to secure our border, because you're not really a nation state unless you do secure your border. That's kind of the number one definition, along with currency, and it's also incumbent upon us to process the people who do come across. One thing I don't understand at all is sort of the argument that, well, we just don't have enough facilities, and these people, including children, have to cool their heels, as you said, under like the Star Trek blankets, while they're waiting for us to build new facilities. If we can't process them, then it's better to just let them go and make their way to a payphone and call their relatives and go where they're going than it is to treat them in an inhumane way. Needless to say, I don't think this is a good way to run a border, but it's better than what they're doing now.
And here's one of the other sides of it, is that we have, over the last couple of years, seem to perpetually discover and then forget this story. And it's happened in just the past couple of weeks where there is a period of time, Congress passes the COVID relief bill. That's through. Biden signs it, of course, and that's done. And then there's an opening in the media space where that bill had taken over for a time. Then the media turns its attention to the migrant crisis, which, as ever, is worth covering. Then the beginning of this week, and again, that gets media attention for a couple of weeks. The beginning of this week, the Derek Chauvin trial starts, and pretty much all of the air is sucked towards that story and away from most others, including the migrant crisis. And even though this weekend, Thursday, Friday, over the weekend, you saw congressional officials, whether it was Ted Cruz or Ilhan Omar, heading down to the border to cover that story. That gets a bit of coverage at the beginning of this week, but then it pretty much fades from the Overton window, passes out of the periphery of our attention, and we move on and are distracted by, again, big news stories in their own way. But it's this sort of cup and ball game of what gets covered at any given point in time, and it seems to only serve in the long run us forgetting about these stories, not ever actually really addressing the deeper problems and just moving on. And again, when you guys are talking about Hernandez, that is, with Honduras specifically, one of the bigger problems. The coups that we have pulled off either successfully or that we've tried to pull off unsuccessfully in Venezuela, in Bolivia, those, of course, would also only contribute to this problem. But of course, I mean, you're talking about Honduras. That was a successful coup. We are still living on the other side of that. We're still dealing with the consequences. And it's weird. You use the phrase, Ted, chickens coming home to roost. We are the fox and we are the hen house. It's just that these aren't our chickens. And so we're happy to kill them, or we're happy to sacrifice them when it suits our needs. But it seems like we won't take responsibility for them. That doesn't ever come up. And I wish that, if this story did have longevity, if it were to be covered not just for a few weeks, but for a few months, there is a small chance, admittedly a very small chance, that would come to the media's attention, that the history there might start to circulate. But because it doesn't ever, we don't ever actually address the real reason for what's going on here. Do you think this is specifically America's actions to our south? Is this the fundamental reason that we're seeing the migrant crisis? If it isn't, if it's one of many, simply, what would you list those as? Or do you see this as the one that deserves to be at the forefront of our attention, Ted?
Well, it deserves to be at the forefront of our attention because it's one that we could control easily to our benefit and to the benefit of the countries involved. But I don't think that it is the only reason, obviously. If I had to rank them, I mean, first and foremost, we have a long policy by both parties of leaving the southern border open, right? I mean, it is kind of ridiculous. There's no situation there's no parallel to this anywhere else on the planet. You can't cross the border. There's no fluid border crossing between, say, China and Mongolia. There's, even though it's a very remote, long border, and people would want to cross it. It just isn't a thing. We don't secure our border because we've had this policy of allowing cheap immigrant labor to come in and bring down, which suppresses wages across the board. And that's been a concern that, unfortunately, the left has largely abdicated in the U.S., except for some progressives historically, but not even recently. And now the right and the Trumpists and the nativists have that issue all to themselves, even though it is legitimate. And basically the Republicans, who are more aligned with big business than the Democrats, have liked the cheap labor, and the Democrats like the fact that second-generation migrants who stay here are demographically more likely to vote Democratic. So it's kind of been a devil's bargain. But first and foremost, leaving the border unguarded, unattended, and de facto open for decades has gotten us where we are. And also, I would say that U.S. Policy towards Mexico, in terms of basically tolerating sort of a corrupt and inefficient and poor regime that is governed by just a few wealthy families, created an intense pressure on people who were seeking a better life to try, to sort of drive a population surge to the north. You can't really have this kind of instability between neighboring countries. You notice we don't have the same issues between the U.S. and Canada because the U.S. and Canada have more or less similar economies and standards of living. And so it started out with Mexico. Now, of course, the flow is traversing Mexico from Central America. And it's a problem that I think is kind of easily solved, but there's not really any political will to solve it.
That's unfortunate. I mean, because I don't even think it's political will per se, Ted. I think they don't even acknowledge it, which is my issue with it. Like, it's one thing if media was honestly acknowledging why they're showing up at our border, why there are all of these kids here. But what Joe Biden would say is, well, there are earthquakes, floods, natural disasters, Jesus coming back, the Michael Jackson dying. There's all of these things that are causing it, none of which are at the doorstep of the U.S. That is so disingenuous in the way that they talk about it. And if they're going to talk about it in such a disingenuous way, trying to solve it is off the table. And regarding it in honest terms at this point is off the table. It's like press has a very confined and very specific range of debate and conversation they could talk about this issue on. And us being implicated in it is not part of it. The voice that you guys are listening to is Ted Raw. He's a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted will be back with us in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a moment.
Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are turning to the legalization of marijuana in New York, arguably not as globally important as the migrant crisis from our south, or for that matter, the refugee crisis going on around the world, centered in the Middle East, but happening in quite a few places, including Myanmar recently. But let's turn back to New York, and let's talk about weed, I suppose. Because it is important. 17th state, I believe, to fully legalize it just passed yesterday. And, pretty standard provisions here, 21 and over, free use. Local governments and I believe some county governments can exempt themselves from retail sales of marijuana. But I'm sure many will go through with it. And Ted, we're talking to you about this. I don't know if you partake. I think it would now be fully legal for you to say if you do. But mostly because you live in New York. You live in New York City specifically. What do you think about this? How do you think this is going to be received by New Yorkers, Ted?
Oh, New Yorkers are definitely in favor of this. I don't partake at all, but I have lots of friends who do, obviously. Most of us do. And I'm very happy for them that they're going to be able to indulge in one of their favorite pastimes without having to worry about being arrested for nonsense. I can say that one of the only times I've ever been arrested was for the guy driving in my car who had weed in his car. Got pulled over in Massachusetts, and as a young man, and marijuana was classified as something as a Class D narcotic. And spent the night in jail, and it was pain, and there were hundreds of dollars in legal fees involved, and travel expenses to attend court. I mean, it's nonsense. It's my record was expunged, but years ago. But lots of people of color, in particular, but a lot of other people, have gone through this. I think expunging the records, which is coming with this law, is a start. But frankly, I think there should be financial compensation for anybody who was jailed or even incurred like minor expenses, like I did. I think you should be able to say, hey, this idiocy cost me $500 and a couple of days of lost wages. It never should have been against the law in the first place. It's clearly prohibition didn't work. it's easy to regulate this in terms of we have laws against driving while impaired, so those cover driving while stoned. I guess my only negative here is in general, I have a dislike in general of drugs because I think they kind of rot your brain. But I think that's people's choices to make. Lots of things do that. Junk food does it. Wine does it. It's just there's I think it's a common sense thing. I guess in about a year we're going to see dispensaries so that people are going to be able to get legal product. And one more sort of personal thing for me is, I have a son who, recently a friend of his OD'd because something he smoked was laced with some kind of PCP type thing, and he almost died. It's good to see this get out of the hands of drug dealers who may or may not be reputable and be made, have a product that is reliable and inspected by health inspectors and so on.
And to go further than that, Joe Biden, who said he was going to decriminalize and move it from the scheduling, basically marijuana is considered the same scheduling as crack and heroin, and that is ludicrous. And as somebody who does partake and have no issue telling people because I don't necessarily think it should be illegal. I think it's lunacy to consider this drug illegal for multiple points. For one, to pretend as if it's the same level of cocaine or heroin is, on its face, comically ridiculous. To act as if there's no medical benefits for the drug is absurd at this point. I mean, it's patently false. But also why it came about. And I find that to be one of the most important and pressing reasons why we should get rid of these drug laws. Personally, I'm for getting rid of all of them, but if nothing else, definitely one on pot. This is John Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman worked with the Nixon administration, and he's having a conversation in Harper's Magazine back in 1994. And he says, you want to know what this was really about? The Nixon White House, or the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against being black, or against the war. But getting people to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt the communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them at night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Now, this quote is very straightforward. This has been there for God knows how long. And one Democratic president after the next, including the black hippie, who under Nixon's model would have been criminalized for being black and a hippie, both of those things, for the most part, still didn't get rid of it. Like, my biggest argument against these drug wars or these drug laws is for the reason that they were put into place, and they were being done for political effect. It was entirely political expedience. The reality of it was that there was no there to it. Get rid of these laws. And I agree with you. There should be some kind of compensation for people that got swept up into this type of political planning. What are your thoughts about this, Ted? Did you know about this one, the quote from the Nixon campaign? And how do you view this under the model that many of those people that got locked up, many of those people that are sitting in jail right now that had to deal with those fines, and also put into place 42% of the population make $18,000 a year? What does it look like to get stopped and frisked and then get a citation for pot after being stopped and frisked when you weren't doing anything and you were going back and forth in your way? That's a lot of information I'm introducing here, Ted. But what are your thoughts about this? Did you know about the drug thing and like the consequences associated with somebody getting caught who don't have the ends for something like this? It destroys their life. Please talk.
The John Ehrlichman quote is awesome. I had not heard it yet, but it totally rings true. It makes so much sense. I mean, for anyone who's old enough, which I just sort of almost am, to remember just how insanely toxic and hysterical the war against groups like the SDS, Weather Underground, and Black Panthers were. I mean, they killed the guy in his bed while he was sleeping, and COINTELPRO and all this. It totally is true. The Nixon administration was at war with the left, and there was a real left that they had some cause to be afraid of because they were so powerful. And this definitely rings true to me. It feels right. And look, I agree with you. I don't think that any kind of drug or narcotic should be criminalized at all. I mean, even if you look at so-called hard drugs like heroin or cocaine, these are, we have to look at these as substance abuse issues. This is a medical issue. These are people who need help, not incarceration. It's, from a conservative standpoint, completely a waste of money to keep these people behind bars and deprive us of their economic contribution in terms of taxes and labor. But it's just inhumane from a progressive standpoint to take people who need help and throw them into prison and criminalize something that is not criminal behavior. It is literally the most victimless crime of all, except the user, him or herself. I don't know how anyone could argue. I mean, I know they will, but I don't know how they can.
Well, and let's talk about another sort of deeper overhaul. And this is a much more significant one in its own way on a federal level. We're talking about Biden's infrastructure plan, approximately $2 trillion. He rolled it out and gave quite a bit more information specifically on how that money would be spent. And Jamarl and I have been going back and forth on this throughout our headlines this morning. But I want to turn to you, Ted. What are your first thoughts seeing this bill? Some of the details of it at least come out.
Well, so first of all, it's not really an infrastructure plan the way that we think of it. The architects and other major civil engineering organizations for years have been warning that America's bridges, tunnels, and highways are crumbling away, that we're getting passed by countries like China. A lot of bridges are old WPA projects from the 30s. And they haven't been properly maintained. I bike under the George Washington Bridge that connects Upper Manhattan to New Jersey every few days, and I marvel at the rust underneath there. There's so many tens of thousands of cars crossing there. I wouldn't be surprised if the whole thing collapsed one day. It's crazy, and it's like that all over the country. But when we think of infrastructure plan, we're thinking of that kind of stuff. Biden has added a lot of stuff. For example, about 20% of the $2.3 trillion package is dedicated to building new housing for the elderly. And you know what? I read that some people are shocked by that. That's actually really smart because boomers and Gen Xers are hitting retirement age now. And, I'm an old Gen Xer. I'm 57. I'm as old as a Gen Xer can be. But, I could conceivably be qualified for, a retirement center within 10 years. So it's happening, and we're not prepared at all. Those facilities are already overcrowded and poorly run, as we've seen over the last year during the pandemic. And so that is infrastructure. And there's lots of other stuff like that. There's that's in the package. There's a lot of complaint, as to be expected, about the way it's going to be paid for, which is, I guess, over a long time. It wouldn't be paid for until 2036. And it would be by a small increase in corporate taxes, basically almost going back to the corporate tax rate before Donald Trump slashed it. And of course, so big business is going to complain, and they're whining. Their Republican and Democratic backers are going to be trying to run interference there. You could say this is all stuff that we have to pay for one way or the other, and the details kind of don't really matter. But the problem is that the debate will get completely bogged down in the details. And here's where you have to. I worry that you're going to see conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin really go from wobbly to voting with the Republicans against this sort of thing for two reasons. First of all, it counters their political interest in supporting running interference for their corporate donors, and it's also going to give Biden a win that they kind of don't really want to give him.
Well, real quick, do you think Biden will intervene in that? Like, if Manchin did that, like the $15 an hour minimum wage, I didn't believe Joe Biden backed it, but he said it. I don't believe that Joe Biden backs the union thing, even though he says it. He always screams unions. Like, that's the only part of speeches that he can be strong about. Unions built America. What was I saying? Oh, right. The immigrants at the border. Like, it's the part that he gets strong on in his speech. Do you think that if Manchin said, yeah, I'm not going to back this, that Joe Biden would use the bully pulpit to go after him, that he would use the gravitas of the office to try to bring him on board? Or do you think it would be like the 15, where he would just kind of sit there, an inert puff of smoke? I'm very curious about this.
I don't think. Yeah, I mean, I think it's near and dear to him more than the $15. We talked about the minimum wage increase. I think we all agreed that Biden never was going to do that. He didn't care. He cares about this more, but does he care about it as much as he did the COVID relief package? I think not that much. And then there's the bigger, broader question is, with Joe Biden's mental state, and which we saw at the press conference, it was pretty sad. Is he capable of speaking extemporaneously,
I was wondering that too.
spontaneously, which is necessary to use the bully pulpit? I don't think so. He can read some speeches. He can certainly do that, but that's not the same thing as sort of going on day after day, taking questions, and really being able to pour on the pressure.
Yeah, agreed. 1,000% agree. Because you would have to get up there and you would have to castigate the people who are against you. You would have to take questions from reporters. You'd have to talk off the top of your head. And you'd have to be able to have barbs, insults. Like, you have to be able to pursue a case. And I haven't seen him do that at all. Not since maybe the debates. But even with the debates, they were somewhat dodgy. Ted, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you coming on. The voice that you guys were listening to is Ted Rall. He's a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall and read his comments. Read his cartoons or see his cartoons and read his articles at Rall.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment taking your calls. The number is 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're in one of our elusive, increasingly rare open segments at 8:45. We're taking your calls now, and again at the end of the show in an hour. The phone number is 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We've got a caller on the line and room for more. Again, 202-521-1320. Michael calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. How's it going, man? How are you doing? What's going on?
Yeah, hi guys. I've been temporarily indisposed in a Antonio Gramsci, not prison but asylum. And I'd like to say hello to the guy from Russia who always calls in. He's on your show class, not Peter Lavelle, but the other one, Mark Sloboda.
Mark Sloboda.
Gramsci. He likes Antonio Gramsci, and I do too. I empathise with Antonio Gramsci. Basically, I'd like to talk in the coin. I'd like to call in firstly, basically about just a quick point on the Nobel Peace Prize. It seems that you have to be a war criminal to win the Nobel Peace Prize. George Bush was actually nominated for it, but Barack Obama won it, and he actually won it for what George Bush did. And Barack Obama took 2 wars to 7. And the next point I'd like to call in was on the legalization of marijuana. Well, what I'm for the decriminalization and the legalization of marijuana. There's a famous book by an unknown dystopian writer called Aldous Huxley that talks about Soma. And basically, Soma was a drug they supplied to a genetically engineered society, but we're basically being a socially engineered society. whereby the alphas and the betas and the epsilons were divided up amongst classes and given certain tasks to perform, and supplied with a certain drug called soma that kept them happy and from forgetting about all their problems and all the problems of society that they created. So although why I freely admit that alcohol and other drugs cause much more damage to society, such as codeine being legalized by Purdue Pharma, and alcohol being legalized for many years, and also DuPont. It's well known that DuPont was actually behind the criminalization of marijuana. Basically, DuPont, one of the board of directors' sons were one of the board of directors' fathers was a senator in the US who ran this campaign around the criminalization of hemp. It was cheaper to produce it in Ireland. And also, I'd like to basically point out that over 50% of Nobel Prize winners have admitted to using some type of, or other than the Peace Prize, have admitted to using a hallucinogenic prior to their discovery that led to their winning the Nobel Prize, and that's admitted. And just quickly on that point.
I have not seen that statistic. I want to pause there because I was going to turn to psychedelics too in the conversation about Soma and Huxley, who also wrote The Doors of Perception and the book Island. I've only read Brave New World. I haven't read the other two. But in the other two, specifically The Doors of Perception, he's talking about his mescaline use, again, a psychedelic drug by any definition, and how that helped him. If you'd be willing to shoot me either a link or just give me a reference, the fact that the majority of Nobel Prize winners credited their discoveries to the use of psychedelics, where do you get that?
Well, I don't actually have the link, but I have heard it in passing on documentaries. And just one other point about Abraham Lincoln, I believe he was a hemp farmer, and I believe he was probably sitting on his veranda smoking his own crop and looking at the black slaves in the field thinking, why don't we free these fellows? Why aren't they equal to us? And on that point, I believe black free men were given a quarter of a vote under the Constitution, but white free women weren't given any vote.
So, there you go. No, Michael, thank you for the call. I want to turn back just because my mind got stuck on it. The Brave New World mention that you gave, the idea of Soma, this sort of ubiquitous and unnamed drug that was used in the society to pacify the senses and dull people's ability to rebel or even, think critically, for that matter, about the society that they were living in the society presented in Brave New World. That definitely comes to mind when I think about a lot of drugs that people use, including often weed, including marijuana, cannabis. But at the same time, and like I mentioned, Huxley, in an earlier book he wrote, The Doors of Perception, and in his last novel, Island, presented more positive use cases for drugs, specifically for hallucinogens or psychedelics. And like you mentioned, I think there are positive ways to use some of these things. And in the case of weed, for instance, I think it's any individual's right and prerogative to try to figure out whether those things would be useful for them. I think they should be legal. And I think that society would probably benefit from them being used more. But that's my opinion. Anyway, Jamarl, we've got another caller and we're taking more, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, what do you think?
Yeah, I think society would be better off if it's used more. I think we should get rid of, look, I don't believe any drug should be illegal. That's where I'm at. I'm a hardliner on this one. And I get that there could be negative repercussions for that policy. By the same token, people are using these drugs now. And I strongly suggest that if it wasn't for the hardships that we face in our daily societal life, that the use of drugs would be far less. Meaning this thing of trying to deaden yourself because things are so difficult wouldn't necessarily be there. And you would even ask the question, would people use crack? Would people use heroin in a world where the society we didn't have these alienated components of our society? I suppose that answer is always going to be on some level yes, but I suppose we can get that number to be far dramatically less, even without the drug laws. And yeah, that's an act of faith. That's a hypothesis. But I don't necessarily think that's an insane one. And yeah, I agree with you, Shane. I do think our society will be better off with more people using pot as opposed to, let's say, alcohol. I know for me, it helps me hit my heart center. And what I mean by that is I tend to think of the world in a slightly different way with more empathy than I do under the normal model to which I operate, where I think about this stuff as action and consequence. And so look, I know for me that it's a positive attribute. I can't necessarily say it for everybody, but the people that I've been around who are smoking pot as opposed to alcohol, I would rather be around a stoner 1,000 times a week as opposed to an alcoholic once. They tend to be aggressive. They tend to be violent. They tend to, the way they talk and engage. Whereas a guy who's a stoner is just kind of chill. He wants to talk about your weird stuff. Let's talk about the space and galaxies. Yeah, let's have those conversations. I want you to have that expanded conversation. I want you to think about your world in larger, more empathetic, more expanded terms that go beyond just the typical day-to-day way of which we operate. That's a positive. That's positive.
The only real downside, in my opinion, I guess there are a couple of them. If you're smoking it, that's not as good for your lungs. You can develop not necessarily lung cancer, because there are some contraindications. The idea that weed might actually prohibit the growth of lung cancer, I don't know. I haven't gotten deep into the science on that, but it's certainly emphysema. I know people who've been habitual weed smokers who developed emphysema. Different case entirely. If you're dry vaping or if you're taking edibles, those are obviously. Those are others. It's just the short-term memory loss that is real.
That
I'm
too.
not saying it's permanent, but the short-term memory loss from regularly smoking weed is a very real and damaging thing. And again, I'm not saying damaging in a permanent sense, but as for instance, we host this radio show. I want to have a grasp on the facts, and I haven't smoked weed in a long time. I like it when I do it. I've had some dependency issues, and so I've kind of learned that I need to be very cautious around it. But even when I was using it regularly, the short-term memory loss stuff is a very real part of that. And
it's depressing,
something people should be aware of.
They should be aware of. And kids shouldn't smoke pot.
Yeah.
In general. Like if I had a kid, I would not have the kids smoke pot. I mean, there's the evidence on that, or the research on that shows that the kids have inability in regards to motivation, difficult times in regards to, like you said, memory loss. And this is at the point where the kid needs to be able to grasp facts, information, and yes, motivation. Because that's what's going to get that kid out of school. That's what's going to get that kid to be successful. And keep in mind, it is far more vital when that kid is a kid to be motivated and to be aware of his environment and his world. So yeah, when it's a kid, I would say no. But at the point where that adult becomes an adult, and if that adult can function, let it go ahead. It's funny though. I've met people who say, I've been smoking pot for 20 years and I'm not addicted. It's like, how do you know, buddy? How do you know? But it's not addiction in the way we're talking about cigarettes.
It is not physical. No. It's closer to cigarettes. It's further away from alcohol or opiates. Where with alcohol and opiates, you can, specifically with alcohol, delirium tremens. You can literally, if you're a severe alcoholic, you can actually die in withdrawals if you withdraw quickly enough, if you stop drinking quickly enough. It's a legitimate thing. Many folks already know about this, but if you don't, look it up. And with opiates, there is a physical component. With a lot of the harder drugs, including alcohol, there's a physical component. With weed, it's emotional and psychological, and that does not mean it's real. I know people who've been regular smokers and then they stop smoking, and they're agitated and angry for weeks, and it is hard to deal with them. It's very hard for them to deal with themselves. And that is, I don't want to dismiss that either, but it's not on the same level. We got another caller, and I think we should go to him. We've got Robert calling in from DC. Robert, you are on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey guys, what's happening? Long-time listener. I heard something about a secret interview that Trump did that was banned. I didn't understand it. I didn't know if I should try to look it up or not. But is there some truth to that? And what's going on with our man Baltimore Charles? I haven't heard from him on the air in a while. I just wanted to send a shout out to the old boy. I ain't been up there in a while, but I was curious about that secret interview that I heard about. Have you heard anything about it?
Secret interview?
I have not heard anything about it. For what? I guess, first of all, good for you. The moment you hear something is banned, you want to go and find it, which is a natural human instinct. Mine too. Right. But I hadn't heard about this, and looking into it real quick. Granted, if Google's going to suppress it, Google's going to suppress it. But I'm not saying anything come up. Jamarl, have you heard about this?
I haven't heard about it, but if it's a secret interview, I want to hear it. I want to hear it. I mean, just naturally, right? It's like, oh, what secret interview? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know about this one. If you guys have more information on it, definitely give us a heads up. I mean, if there's leaks, if there's data that you guys think we need, if there's information that you think should be aired, yeah, send us emails. People do it all the time. Hey, we have this story that I think you guys should talk about. Bam, here it is. Or, hey, you guys were talking about this. I think you're full of it. Here's a link that I think you're full of it on. Like, we get that stuff all the time. At least I do.
Maybe I haven't learned my lesson. I bet I haven't really had any reason to. So far, I've only had good experiences giving my email address out, shanestranahan@gmail.com. If you want to reach me, that's my personal email address. We also have the faultlinesradio@gmail.com address. But the first, if you want to hit me up, that's the best way to do it. And anytime you have a clip, a story, anything like that, you want to contribute, anything you think I should get my eyes on or Jamarl should see, please feel free to send it our way. Anyway, we need to close this hour out, folks. Great couple hours so far. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of today's show. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour of this morning's show. That's the most disruptive show, covering news, events, politics, and more from across our disunited states and the surface of our increasingly fragmented globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And on the left corner, part of this disunited states also, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I have just realized, Jamarl, in a completely random non sequitur, that if you were Canada looking down at the United States, like the country Canada, you would actually be on its left corner, and I would actually be floating somewhere in the center, independent. I'm in South Dakota. You're just north of Washington, D.C. You just call it Washington, D.C. You would be on the left. I'd be in the middle. There wouldn't be anybody on the right. We bring them onto the show sometimes, although often when they do, they're on the East Coast like you, so I don't know. It kind of falls apart there. But anyway, that is true. To give people a brief overview of today's show, at 7:30, we spoke with Alexander Mercouris about the European Union and Russia, with Putin meeting with Merkel and Macron, the heads of Germany and France, respectively, with Putin, of course, being the head of Russia, in a virtual meeting on Tuesday, a couple of days ago, talking about vaccine procurement, specifically the EU potentially procuring the Sputnik V vaccine for their use. We also spoke about Marine Le Pen's upswing in France, how she's faring, what her policies would be, and how she would contrast with Macron. And basically, Mercouris' point was that she continues on the policies of Charles de Gaulle in many ways. And it's almost like she's looking back to him as a representative figure, or she's just continuing tacitly the policies that he had as a sort of right-wing, more nationalistic, politician in the French political scene. Then at 8:15, we just recently finished up a conversation with Ted Rall. We were talking about Biden's migrant crisis, the fact that marijuana has just been legalized in New York State. We also briefly talked about the infrastructure bill. Later on in this hour, starting in about 10-15 minutes here, we're going to be talking with Garland Nixon about the Derek Chauvin trial and more on Biden's infrastructure bill. But without further ado, let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, at least 1,138 new coronavirus deaths and 68,162 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 64,396 cases per day. That's an increase of 17% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 30,485,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, while over 551,600 people in this country have died from it. Los Angeles County's public health director, Barbara Ferrer, said that based on numbers received from the federal government, Los Angeles should reach herd immunity in late June. That's due to the fact that they're due to reach 80% vaccine coverage in residents over 16 years old in the next 12 weeks. This means that by the end of June, the country should have received through vaccines and natural infections the 70 to 85% of immunity that's required for community immunity or herd immunity to the virus. And again, for those who haven't been following this one, The idea there is if enough of the population gains immunity, either through direct vaccinations or through contracting the virus on their own, if enough of the population gets that immunity, then like oxygen, there not being enough oxygen in a space to keep a fire going, the virus will just die out of its own accord. It won't be able to spread quickly enough to keep spreading. And so it'll sort of reach all these cul-de-sacs, all these dead ends, and you'll see, a reduced rate of transmission where you don't need to worry about its infectiousness. The thing with COVID, though, a couple of things here. For one, as Fauci has brought up in his back and forth with Rand Paul, and as he's brought up repeatedly, there's this idea that you have different strains that will circulate that come into being as the virus circulates, different mutations that pop up, that those strains don't provide full overlap in terms of if you get immunity to one strain, you might not have immunity to others. So you could see more carrying on in that way. And then also there are lingering concerns that immunity to the virus isn't a permanent thing, that you get immunity either through vaccination or through contracting the virus independently. And then at a certain point, that immunity may fade away, as of course you do see with the flu. So we will see what exactly happens there. But good news for LA County, assuming this holds true. India has said that it will begin vaccinating those over the age of 45 against the coronavirus, whether or not they have comorbidities. India had previously been vaccinating those over the age of 5 when they had one or more of 20 comorbidities. It also been vaccinating those aged 60 or over and all frontline and healthcare workers. More than 72,000 cases were reported in the last day in India. That's their highest daily figure since last October. The head of the World Trade Organization says developed countries should either make enough doses for the whole world or give their research on COVID vaccines to developing countries. AstraZeneca has allowed India's Serum Institute to manufacture its vaccine at cost price. AstraZeneca, as far as I know, at least in the West, is the only vaccine manufacturer to be doing this kind of thing on a not-for-profit basis. That is set to expire towards the middle of this year in summer. We'll see if they keep that going. They've been asked by, I believe, the World Health Organization to extend that not-for-profit guarantee. But again, they stand out as the only prominent company to be doing it this way, which is a good thing and which we should see more of, frankly. The World Health Organization has criticized the rollout of coronavirus vaccines in the European Union as unacceptably slow. Quoting here from WHO Regional Director for Europe, Dr. Hans-Henry P. Kluge, who said, quote, vaccines present our best way out of this pandemic. Not only do they work, they are also highly effective in preventing infection. However, the rollout of these vaccines is unacceptably slow, end quote. And as we were talking about yesterday with Peter Oliver, and as we were talking about this morning with Alexander Mercouris, I do agree. The European Union has been way too slow on the uptake when it comes to intaking vaccines, procuring them. Admittedly, part of that had to do with Brexit and the fallout between the European Union and the United Kingdom as the UK goes through its Brexit process. But regardless, this is unacceptably slow. It seems like they're better regulators, the European Union, than they are manufacturers, but that's old news at this point. Anyway, in national political news, back here in the States, the trial of Derek Chauvin was temporarily put on hold as a 61-year-old witness, Charles McMillian, broke down in sobs as he presented his version of Floyd's death from the witness stand. It quickly picked back up. Charles McMillian was not the only one to cry during the proceedings. Jurors also heard yesterday from Christopher Martin, the 19-year-old Cup Foods employee who first confronted Floyd about the apparently fake $20 bill that he had used to buy cigarettes. Martin said he quickly recognized that Mr. Floyd's $20 bill appeared to be fake. At the urging of his boss, Martin went outside and asked Floyd to pay or to come in and talk to the manager. Floyd then refused, and eventually a manager asked another employee to call the police, which set all of the events in motion. And Martin said that he had regretted not just paying for it himself, substituting his own real $20 bill based on what had happened as a result of that. And if I were in his shoes, I'd probably feel the same way.
I'd feel the exact same way. Yeah, I feel the exact same way. I mean, honestly, calling the cops shouldn't be a death sentence. And my wife and I have been in situations where it's like, all right, we'd like to call the cops for this complaint, but it's a minor complaint and it's unclear on what the cops are going to do. It's that. It's meaning I don't know how this situation is going to turn out. And just because somebody may deal with the cops either in a dismissive or an aggressive way doesn't mean they should die for it. Period. The conversation we had with was the gentleman the other day. What is it? Albert.
Albert Giller.
Yeah, Albert. Where he's like, kids should be trained to treat cops with, kid gloves. Like, you have to be very careful around them. And I made the point to him. I said, what are you saying? They're animals. They're wild animals that you have to teach the kids not to engage, or you have to teach them to be very passive towards. No, screw that. You have the right to petition this government for its grievances. And the foot soldiers that are going to be part of that are the cops. And there are times that, yes, you should treat them with respect. By the same token, they should treat you with respect also. And this idea that these guys shouldn't be taught to de-escalate, that should be part and parcel to their training. That should be the thrust of their training, because the overwhelming majority of cases they're going to engage are not overly hostile. That's very important. Like, the majority of the cases are not going to be maximum justice. It's not going to be that. It's not going to require that. And if the guy's keyed up where every moment is like that, then yes, I can't call for a noise complaint. I can't call for minor items, because I don't know what that cop is going to do, nor do I know what society is going to do to basically give that cop a pass when he does it. It's a shame, because people he shouldn't feel like I screwed up, because he didn't screw up. He did his job. He called the cop on somebody who was passing a $20 bill. That's not wrong. The issue is what happened after the fact, and whether or not it was reasonable to expect a cop to stand on a man's throat for 9 minutes. I'm saying it's not. He feels bad. I would feel bad, but it's not his fault to feel bad. Like, no. I shouldn't have to feel some kind of way about whether or not I could call a cop for some kind of complaint. I want to use cops. Yeah.
He didn't even call the cop. He wasn't even the one to do it. And, if somebody tries to use fake money to buy something, you don't accept it. That's pretty much the rule there. Otherwise, you're going to see runaway inflation in the country as more and more people counterfeit money. I mean, that's just simple incentives, but that doesn't make it his fault. And anyway, we got more headlines. A point taken, Jamarl. Biden has taken his infrastructure plan on the road. He started with an address in Pittsburgh yesterday, calling it the American Jobs Plan. The $2.3 trillion infrastructure bill was pitched by the White House as a, quote, once-in-a-century capital investment, end quote, in U.S. infrastructure that will create millions of good-paying jobs and allow America to outcompete China by spending about 1.1% of GDP per year over the course of 8 years. The plan is set to cost, again, a bit over $2 trillion. It will be presented alongside planned tax hikes on corporations. The key tenets of the plan include modernizing 20,000 miles of highway, repairing 10,000 small bridges and 10 economically significant bridges, eliminating all lead pipes and drinking water systems, expanding access to high-speed broadband, modernizing schools, and upgrading veterans hospitals. Again, as Ted Rall put it, there's a bit more than just infrastructure in there, but a lot of it is infrastructure, so there you go. The administration has said it intends to spend about $650 billion on revamping bridges and roads, $300 billion on housing infrastructure, $300 billion on reviving U.S. manufacturing. That's not infrastructure, but there you go. $400 billion on care for the elderly and disabled, $400 billion on clean energy credits, as well as a currently unspecified amount on broadband, water systems, and other measures. And again, we'll be coming back to this in a couple of minutes, along with the Derek Chauvin trial with our next guest, Garland Nixon. New Pentagon policies are set to allow openly transgender people to serve in the military. As of April 30th, the Pentagon says the rules will, quote, provide a path for those in service for medical treatment, gender transition, and recognition in one's self-identified gender, end quote. The announcement coincides with yesterday's International Transgender Day of Visibility. And I, for one, have no problem with this. Let them serve. 4 people were killed, although quote unquote serve with a lot of the stuff the Pentagon does. Anyway, 4 people were killed, including a child, and 1 other injured in a mass shooting at an Orange County office complex. Information about the suspect and their motive has not yet been released. In international news, Italy has expelled 2 Russian diplomats after an Italian naval officer was caught selling naval documents to an alleged Russian spy handler. Italy's foreign minister said it was an extremely serious matter. Russia has said it would retaliate. Juan Antonio Hernandez, that's the brother of the current Honduran president, has been sentenced to life for drug trafficking and ordered to forfeit just over $138 million for distributing 185 tons of cocaine, purchasing firearms illicitly, and engaging in large-scale bribery. They also say he's complicit in at least 2 murders. Again, Juan Antonio is the brother of the current Honduran president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, also widely thought to be involved in drug trafficking and the subject of an ongoing investigation by U.S. prosecutors. And in our last headline, the country of Yemen has received its first shipment of COVID-19 vaccines. 1/3 of a million AstraZeneca doses arrived at the southern port of Aden. The AstraZeneca vaccines will enable health workers and other priority populations vulnerable to COVID-19 to be protected against the virus, end quote. That's according to the UNICEF, which released that in a statement yesterday. This first batch is part of 1.9 million total doses that Yemen will receive throughout 2021. And those were our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by Garland Nixon, co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, a show right here on Radio Sputnik. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back with Garland in just a minute on the other side of the short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you could do so with the chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. The Derek Chauvin trial has started. Now, this trial had been anticipated because, after all, the George Floyd murder or killing had basically created a large amount of feedback all across the world, not just in the United States. I mean, you had marches all across in every 50 state, yes, but you also had them all the way in Britain, in New Zealand, in Australia, in Germany, all under the solidarity from this killing. So the question becomes, what is going to be the outcome of this case? Now, cops kill 1,000 people a year with 99% walking, 1% or 99% not even charged. The 1% where there's some level of prosecution, only 33% of that 1% go to jail. So from the standpoint of Chauvin, this trial is abnormal in and of itself. And whether or not he will be prosecuted, that's the question. To have this conversation, we're joined with Garland Nixon. He is Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. Garland, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me back, guys.
You are our residential expert on all things police, because you were high up. You had a right much responsibility in regards to the people that were looking up to you and in the job that you were doing. So you were always the guy that we tend to get this kind of background information on. This trial has started, and they have added multiple counts, including a third-degree murder charge that they had basically went to the judge in order to petition the judge to add back on. And when they added that on, my thought was they have concerns about whether or not they will be able to get a larger murder charge. Again, it's against the police. They don't tend to get charged or don't tend to get prosecuted for this. And the thought is the third might be the thing that they end up getting them on if they've charged them too high for the other counts. Am I wrong on that? Like, that seems to be, it's like reach for the stars if you can't cling to the moon. That's what it seems to be, where they want to get him with something and they don't want to walk out of this trial with a loss. What are your thoughts? And what are the chances from your standpoint of getting him? Because to me, what this boils down to is whether or not it was appropriate. Meaning you could say coming there for the $20, fair enough. You could say restraining him, fair enough. But what you can't tell me is standing on a man's throat for 9 minutes is fair and necessary, especially when he was already subdued, when there were other officers already there that could help subdue him if they needed to. You can't justify that length of time nor that restraint. What are your thoughts on this and this trial and whether or not they're going to be able to get him at all? What are your thoughts?
Well, a couple of things. Yeah, I agree with you. It was a move, and I mean, and that's with any trial, with any case. You want to, the prosecutor wants to give themselves the highest probability of winning. So the more charges that you have, the better, the better possibility that you have. And usually, depending upon the state, each state has their particular standards written differently. But when you start getting into things like third degree murder, reckless indifference for human life, manslaughter, things like that, you don't have to prove the same intent. You don't have to prove that somebody intended to kill. Usually, when you start getting into third degree murder, it gets away from the idea, the concept of intent, and it gets towards the concept that any reasonable and prudent person would have known that their actions would have resulted in, either the loss of human life or at least at minimum, severe injury, etc. So I think it was a wise move in the context of this case, because the reality of this case is, having, as you said, having done this, having taught this, and trained police officers, the various aspects of this. To me, one of the most glaring aspects of this is, one of the easiest things to parse out from this, as far as the responsibility for George Floyd's death, is that a requirement that a police officer require aid. For instance, one of the things that we would teach an officer, you're walking down the street and some person grabs his chest and falls to the ground. Some person says, "Oh, I can't breathe." Just a random person to you says, "I feel like I'm falling apart. There's a small accident. Something happens in your presence and it appears that a human being is in distress of some type. You have a responsibility to act, an assertive responsibility, so much so that as a police officer, if you walk away from that, you can be held responsible for that person's death. That's what you're paid and sworn to do. So if everything else falls aside, at the point where George Floyd is saying, I can't breathe, you're killing me, I'm going to die, that assertive responsibility of Derek Chauvin to act, to figure out what is wrong with this person and to act on it. If you lose everything else, which you shouldn't, because this should really be a cut and dried case, that gives you your third degree murder, your manslaughter, your reckless indifference to human life. Whereas they say, well, even if you didn't intend to kill him, you had an assertive responsibility. You didn't act on that assertive responsibility. Therefore, you're responsible for his death. So that's what I think that third degree does. But as far as looking at this, to me, it is an absurdity. I'll add one thing to it, to this. I think right now, in particular, that it's ironic that the U.S. releases this U.S. report on human rights, and they point all over the world. You're Alexei Navalny, a guy who's a convicted embezzler. You know what I mean? The Xinjiang, which anyone can go to the Gray Zone and find thegrayzone.com, find all kinds of information of how those allegations are fraudulent, on and on. But when you go to the Russian or the the Iranian or the Chinese English news websites, they point to the George Floyd trial. They point to these things and say, how dare you attack us for human rights with absurd allegations that are unsubstantiated? The whole world can see what you're doing. So that's my thoughts on it.
So you think that he will be charged with third degree, he'll be convicted of third degree murder, but not the second degree murder charge? Is that kind of where you're drawing the line there, Garland?
I have no, I'll say this. After watching the Walter Scott trial a few years ago, where I saw a police officer shoot a man in the back 5 times and then plant evidence on the body of the victim, and his first trial was a hung jury. After watching that, I have no confidence that there'll be any conviction. I have no confidence that there'll be any level of justice. I personally feel this is a Dred Scott issue that we're looking at, an issue where when I see such obvious evidence of wrongdoing, and there is consistently, and I see officers walk, I think to myself, implicitly, the jurors are looking at it saying, we don't think black people have the legal standing to bring these charges against white police officers. And, the facts of the case be damned. Hey, the police officer did it. Let me add this. In the Rodney King trial, afterwards, one of the jurors when asked, said, well, police officers are no angels. It's tough out there. In other words, yeah, sure, they were guilty, but we're willing to overlook that because we think that the officers should be able to do this. I think that's what you're looking at here. I don't think it's necessarily about the facts of the case. I would suspect there'll be a conviction. I will not be in any way shocked if Chauvin walks on all charges, and it won't shock me at all.
Well, so 2 follow-up questions here that are paired pretty directly. One is, whatever he is convicted of, or if he isn't convicted of anything, if he's cleared of the charges here, what do you think the public response is going to be? And then paired with that, from the perspective of a former cop, looking at this as a highly publicized trial, what are sort of motivations? It seems like the prosecution would benefit from this continuing to be highly publicized, and it undoubtedly will be. But I think you might get where I'm going with this. Often, even though trials are frequently highly publicized, there are many parties that want to keep key aspects of it secret, keep it behind courts, just because the public getting into it can sway things. What are you? First of all, I suppose, what's your take on the first? What do you think the public's response will be? And then second, looking at this as a former law enforcement officer, what do they want when it comes to the public having a perspective on this being so widely publicized? Garland.
It's hard to say, because I believe a big part of the what happened last summer was the political instability in the U.S. That, as Chris Hedges talked about it, the U.S. was a tinderbox and they only needed a match. Let's not forget, we've seen these types of things. We saw the Walter Scott issue. We saw the Eric Garner things of injustices that were blatant and obvious, and there wasn't the level of protests and activity that we see now. I think a big part of that was due to the instability. So I would argue that things aren't quite as unstable now in the U.S. So because of that, I don't think that the level of the protest would be high if he walked away, but I don't think the looting and the things like that will be as significant, because I don't think the country is unstable. So that's something, if he walks, that will challenge my original assertions. I don't, here's the bottom line, as you said, from the O.J. Simpson trial to whatever, a trial like this is going to be broadcast. It's going to be big, and that's just the world we live in now. And I don't think you can look at that as something that, you can take into the account how that will affect the case, because it's the norm now. If there's another, big trials like this, they're going to, with social media and everything, they're going to get a lot of attention, and everything that happens every other second will be on Twitter.
Yeah, that's so wild now. Man, that's so wild. Like, if we were talking about 20, 30 years ago, something happens in the world, it takes a little bit for it to bubble up. Now, something happens, a bomb goes off, a missile is shot, and you got the video on Twitter within a few seconds. It's profound in regards to the level of disruption. What happens behind the scenes? Meaning you were a cop for God knows how many years, and you were high up on the totem pole. When these killings take place, and they happen all the time. They've been happening for years. I mean, if we think back, Black Lives Matter started under Obama, with the assassination of Garner, or the choking to death of Garner. It's not assassination, but the choking to death of Garner. When you were a police officer and these killings would take place, what was the what was the conversation at the water cooler? Or for that matter, what were you guys talking about behind the scenes when these killings would take place? What would be the feeling behind the scenes?
Well, let me give you an example. Now that I'm retired, I can tell lots of stories. Let me give you an example. Some years back when I was a police officer, there was a black man. He was shot, and I'll even tell of the instance, what happened. There was a black man who was shot at the intersection, I believe, of College Parkway and Ritchie Highway, Route 2 in, that would be either Severna Park or Arnold, Maryland. The officer said that he was getting he attacked him with that the subject attacked him with a screwdriver. The people who knew the person said that makes no sense. That guy's never been violent. He had no record of violence, etc. Okay. So the investigation went down. The Anne Arundel County Police found, of course, hey, he did nothing wrong. I was talking to two county officers that I knew, and we were having a discussion, and they said to me, everybody knows it was a bad shoot. He shouldn't have shot that guy. But, I don't think anything's going to happen to him. So the internal discussion on the police department was, yeah, we know he's wrong, but, and we know he's going to walk. And so it was an acceptance. It was sadly, it's what people are saying. It was an acceptance of, this is the culture. Yeah, one of our officers shot and killed a black man, and he was wrong, and we all know he was wrong. Now, the investigation is going to say he was right, and he's going to walk, and they didn't say it, but I'll add it, because that's the way things are. We can get away with it. That's the way we do things. I think it was like they were looking at me like kind of putting their head down like, yeah, we don't feel good about this. But hey, we all know this is the way it is. And hey, let's go get a cup of coffee now. And so that's just an example. People can take anything they want from that exchange. But I would, I mean, I didn't make that up. It is what it is.
That's unfortunate. That really is. Because it hits at this notion.
And let me add, that's why I gave the specific instance, because I didn't want people to think people can look online and find, I don't know if that was the late 80s and the early 90s, but I can tell people that was the instance if you can find that online.
Well, it's like the Tamir Rice thing. I mean, they murder a kid and then everybody backs the guy that did it. And it's like, you have to know that that's wrong. 3 a.m. between, you and your God, you have to know that what you did there was wrong. And the people that were backing him up was wrong. And the union police chief that was backing him up, they were wrong. And so, yeah, I'm always curious about what happens behind the scenes in situations like that when these guys are just kind of talking. The voice that you guys were listening to is Garland Nixon. He's a Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time right here on Radio Sputnik. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're moving from the Derek Chauvin trial to a conversation about Biden's infrastructure plan called the American Jobs Plan. Biden addressed a Pittsburgh audience yesterday to give a pitch on the program that the White House has called a once-in-a-century capital investment in U.S. infrastructure. That's a quote. The plan is set to cost about $2.3 trillion, a bit over $2 trillion. And they're planning on spending, I'm just going to give people a brief rundown on some of the big costs here, $650 billion on revamping bridges and roads, $300 billion on housing infrastructure, $300 billion on reviving U.S. manufacturing, $400 billion on care for the elderly and disabled, another $400 billion on clean energy credits, as well as a currently unspecified amount, currently unlisted amount on broadband, water systems, and other measures. So quite a bit of that does sound like an infrastructure program. As Ted Rall, our earlier guest, put it, there's more than that, though. Again, them spending money on housing infrastructure and on manufacturing, on care for veterans, for the elderly, for the disabled. Those are additions as well. Those fit outside of it. Granted, we're calling it the infrastructure plan. They're calling it the American Jobs Plan, making it rosy as ever. Jamarl and I have kind of mixed feelings on this, as far as I can tell. And our feelings are different in their own ways. I wish we were doing more sort of cutting edge, high tech stuff to not just repair our bridges, for instance, but radically upgrade the sort of international standard, the global standard for what a developed country looks like, for what it's able to do. Jamarl brought up hyperloops. I think those are a good example of, like, whether it's a hyperloop or actual high-speed rail that travels 700 miles an hour, that kind of thing, instead of decaying Amtrak, which I like/love it in a kind of weird nostalgic sense. I've made those cross-country trips, but instead of taking a couple of days, you could get into a situation where they take a couple of hours, and I think our country would benefit greatly from it. Anyway, enough of our sort of long-term pitches. I want to turn to you, Garland. We're joined by Garland Nixon, continuing a conversation from the last segment. Garland Nixon is a Sputnik political analyst and the co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended. That show airs right here on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. And by the way, while we have him, before we bring him in, you can also follow Garland's work on Twitter at Garland Nixon, and also check out Garland on Facebook and YouTube. Garland, I'll turn to you here just to give us your sort of introductory summary thoughts. What are your thoughts about this bill? Do you think it could be better? How do you think it could be worse? Do you think it'll be a success? Just your thoughts. Garland, what do you think?
A couple of things. I think that when I look at this bill, the first thing I think is we've spent between $6 and $7 trillion in the so-called war on terror between 2001 and now. Imagine what that would do for our infrastructure. The reason that we are behind China, the reason we are behind Germany, behind Russia, behind all of these other countries in infrastructure is because we're not a country. We're an empire. A country spends money on its people. Empires don't do that. The only thing we do is support the empire. We still support 800 bases, and we support, a perfect example, the CARES Act. The CARES Act, we put like $33 million in there for overthrowing Venezuela. That money is money that the American people should have. That's just one example. So I look at it and I say, I agree with you both. But here's the problem. Because we are nothing but a warmongering empire, we need both. We let our roads fall behind. We let all the basics fall behind. So our basics have gone to trash. The roads, the electrical grid, et cetera, that's gone to trash because we've spent it all on war and trying to overthrow countries. And we are behind technologically for the same reason. So you are both right. We need to catch up on our roads and bridges and all because that's all gone to trash. And we need to move ahead technologically. But realistically, we can barely do either. Might I add this? As we look at this, right now, we give our Fed puts $120 billion in the market every month ad infinitum going to Wall Street. Again, we spend all of our money on war. We give unlimited funds on Wall Street, where this casino there now, it's just a casino for the rich, but it's not really a casino because in a casino you can lose. The rich people can't lose. So it ends up now that everything's falling apart as it would. It's almost like an alcoholic, a functioning alcoholic who makes good money. He spends all his money at the bar. He comes home, his home's falling apart, his car's breaking down. Why? Because he spends all his money at the bar. We spend all our money at the bar of imperialism. We come home, our country's falling apart. It makes sense to me. And meanwhile, my last comment, when I look for articles on infrastructure, I see one that says Joe Biden touts infrastructure plan as a way to win global competition against China. I see another one that says Trump blasts Biden infrastructure bill as giveaway to China. That's why we're in a position that we're in today, because we don't do anything for America. They don't say this is going to make the American lives better. This is, let's do this for empire so we can keep this empire dominant in the world. the people of America, the infrastructure of America. We haven't taken a back seat to empire. We ain't even in the car anymore. We're being dragged behind the car and killed in this kind of, I guess, over the top analogy. But you get my point, guys.
Yeah, I get your point, and you have a great point because if you think back to Joe Biden's first press conference, the way and the argument that Joe Biden was making sounded like it was America competing with China, not the other way around. And when he's talking about the bridges, the roads, the infrastructure, etc., and he's invoking China as a competitor in this, is very interesting. I'm wondering if the United States and the power problem associated with us had to do with not believing that there was a competitor in the world, that we beat the Soviet Union fell apart, we picked over the corpse, despite the fact that we said we weren't, and that NATO wasn't going to move and everything else. We basically win zero sum. We won. The problem is there's no game to win like that where it just stops. And in our heads, I think it potentially did. So instead of us having competitors, instead of us having management and process and thought and doing things in this kind of intellectual way to ensure that we have the best outcome, we thought we could do whatever we wanted without consequence. And we're finding that that's not true. We're still, the quote unquote, is this, despite being the exceptional nation, there's still physical matter reality that we have to deal with. And I think that's on some level where this issue came from. And when the United States realized we have a competitor, all of a sudden you have hysteria. China is committing genocide. The problem with the vaccine is that they're giving it away. Like, you get that weird policy. What do you think about that? I mean, do you think that part and parcel to the problem is that we believe that we won and that this was a unipolar world, and we are functioning like that despite the fact that the world wasn't that way and it wasn't a situation where you can actually win it? And because that competitor wasn't there, we didn't have something what we would consider to petition ourselves against and push against. And so it kind of got flabby, and we lost something in regards to the world stage and world power, especially around this notion of soft power. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, I know that gets into this kind of geopolitics and almost a philosophical aspect of geopolitics. But what are your thoughts?
I think that's a good evaluation of things, and I'm with you. And I would add this: the issue here, I think, is the concept of power. How does power work, right? If you read you go to the Global Times and read a lot of the stuff that China is saying about their alliances with other countries, you'll find this word: mutual benefit, win-win. That is a concept that says Garland and Jamarl, if they have an issue, they should sit down as equal partners and they should work it out. The U.S. Concept of power is one of one group. One side has all the power, the other side has none, and we have to have all the power because, in the same way that we use our power in a malevolent way to dominate the world, if we give up, either we have all of it or none. So if someone else has all of the power, they'll treat us the same way we're treating them. It's a fear that somebody else is going to get all the power and they'll do us in the same way that we're doing everyone else. And that's what we are. We're trapped in this circle of horror and fear, So that's the issue, I think. We can't come to a mutually beneficial agreement with anybody because we don't believe in the concept of mutual benefits. It's the Wolfowitz. Everyone should look up the Wolfowitz doctrine. That's what it is. It's absurd. It's ridiculous, and it is coming home to haunt us. And this infrastructure bill just simply shows it. Where we are regarding our infrastructure is exactly where we should be, based on the fact that we spent $6 trillion trying to dominate the world. That's just the Middle East. I mean, that's the so-called war on terror. What about all the other things that we were doing around the world to overthrow governments and, USAID, USNED, these CIA cutouts? So where we are is where an empire should be. It's quite natural. And now we realize that, and we're trying to catch up at home. But even now, we're not trying to catch up at home in order to make our country better, in order to address our issues, in order to address the issues in the lives of our people. Even now, we're only doing it to try to gain an upper hand on China. It's pathetic and sad to sit back and watch the U.S. do this. Everything falls apart, and we're like, yeah, we got to do this for imperialist reasons. And Americans, sadly, don't even get that. Instead, they're like, yay, an infrastructure bill. They're doing it to make our lives better. It's pathetic. But what are they going to? Yeah, I mean, they're propagandized day and night. What are Americans going to know otherwise than that?
Well, unlike the Romans, I think that this is more anemical. The idea that we would be the head of an empire, that there would be an American empire. If that were a meme, if that were widely accepted or known or seen in American society, I think there would be more pushback against it. But like you say, we're propagandized, and so that isn't seen. But here's another take on this. Aren't we an empire without an emperor at this point? Biden is barely fit to ship. Trump, in his own weird way, pushed back against some of the worst excesses militarily, although he didn't do a very good job at it. And of course, he brought Bolton in, he brought Pompeo in. I guess my point is, even in the Roman Empire, you had the Praetorian Guard. Some people have likened the CIA to the Praetorian Guard, but it seems like power is much more diffused in a sort of amorphous network, whether it's members of the intelligence community, members of various banks, whether you're talking about NGOs with sway, whether you're talking about the heads of corporations. It seems like there is an oligarchy, certainly, that has its hands on the reins, but there is not a single player. And for the worst, one of the things that means is there's no single person that can come in and potentially fix it. It is a sort of self-perpetuating mechanism that keeps this all going. We've got to close this out pretty soon here, Garland, but how do you fix something like that?
Yeah, well, here's what I would say. You don't fix it. You know what I mean? To me, that's like jumping off a cliff and you're in the air and people are like, hey, you got a plan? I'm sorry. You should have had a plan before you jumped. There ain't no plan. And what's happening with the U.S., this is the natural occurrence of an empire. This is the natural outcome of what we're doing. So we're talking about, think about this. A person is an alcoholic and they say, how can I fix this thing without giving up liquor? You know what I mean? That's what we want to do. We want to fix it without stop being an empire. Yeah, the answer is we got to do something that we ain't willing to do.
And we're not going to do it. I hear your point. Yeah, you know what? Maybe it's just that I'm young or stupid, but I still hold out hope that there's some way to fix this, that there is some way to keep it from going. But good on you. Between sitting in the rear car, being pulled along, and you just bringing up us going off the track, you kept the railway metaphor going for that whole segment. We got to get this.
Look, sadly, we're on a maglev high-speed train to bad times.
It is true. I don't like that. At that point, it just becomes a torpedo. But hey, we got to close this out. We were joined for this segment and the last by Garland Nixon. He's a Sputnik political analyst and the co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended. That show airs right here on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. Also, you can and you should follow Garland on Twitter at Garland Nixon. Also, check him out on Facebook and YouTube. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but when we come back, we are taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. Be right back on the other side of this short break for the last segment of today's show.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're back and we're in the wrap. The last segment of the show this day. And my last segment of the show this week, I'm not going to be joining Jamarl tomorrow. He will be hosting the show on his own and doing a great job at it, I'm sure. I'm going on a bike trip with my brother. The last chance we have to do so as we enter spring. And as I'm heading back to DC pretty soon to go back into the studio, really looking forward to that. Anyway, I'll give a brief debrief when I come back on Monday about the bike trip, not because it's of universal interest, but because I'll probably have had a good time. And if I don't have a good time, if I have a terrible time and like get bit by a snake and break my leg and somehow make it back on time, then that'll be its own story. And I'm sure that'll be a fun one. Anyway, We're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We have calls on the line and room for more. Again, 202-521-1320. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, thanks for the call. How are you doing? What's on your mind?
How y'all doing? Thanks for taking our call. Everybody call. Thank y'all. Free Julian Assange. I support Craig Moore as well and other journalists and whistleblowers that need our support and help. I had wrote the EPA repealing the decision from the classified pipe as personal privacy information, basically asking them why would the classified pipe that's underground that carry water from the city of Houston to Mikey DeBakey, why would they classify it as personal privacy information? And please lift it up and give it to me so I can bring forward my case to the federal government. So that's what I got. That's what I can do. But I don't think they're going to lift it because, that would open up a can of worms, So still pushing for my case, and we still got to push for Julian Assange and support Rick Leach and everybody else that's whistleblowers and activists. That's all I want to say.
Tarif, thank you for the call. And as always, good luck with that case. You talked about that many times. And I think part of your support for Julian Assange comes as a whistleblower, as somebody who's blown the whistle in the past and understood and appreciated. Again, 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. That's the number. We're open for your calls. Good show so far, I think, Jamarl.
Agreed. Yeah, quite good. I enjoyed all of the interviews.